Yeah, and then you also mentioned another thing. You said when things are possible, people will do them, and you make an example of taxes and drugs. You say those things are illegal, but people do them anyways. And how can you find them out if you don't know where things are, right?
Well, indeed, and that's why I'm pessimistic. And I think if you ask me what's my biggest worry in the next 20 years, it is pandemics which are engineered artificially. As I mentioned in my book, I think about 9 years ago, two groups of scientists showed they could make the influenza virus more virulent and more transmissible by engineering it. And they will be able to do the same thing for the coronavirus, and they'll be able to synthesize the smallpox virus and all that. Obviously, there will be regulations against all these things, internationally agreed, and academies of different countries are already discussing these. But the point I made, and the reason I'm scared, is just what you say, that we can't enforce these laws globally any more than the tax laws or the drug laws. And that's because they don't require large special purpose facilities like making an atom bomb does. We have the International Atomic Energy Agency, which can, with reasonable success, monitor what countries are doing in the nuclear arena. It's very hard for them to get away. I mean, Israel's made a pretty good job of it, but it's pretty hard for countries to actually get away with too much. But in the context of biological weapons, the technology is present in many university labs, many industrial labs, it's dual use, etc. And we can't monitor all those labs all the time. And I think one of the problems is that there's going to be a growing tension between three things we want to preserve: privacy, security, and freedom. Because even if a few people are mavericks and try to build a weapon, that's too many. And so I think we've got to accept that there will have to be more sort of surveillance. And the way the balance is struck between those three things will be different in different countries. I guess the Chinese will be happier to give up their privacy in order to have security. The Americans at the other extreme may be reluctant, and they'll have to accept greater insecurity. But I think that's a problem, simply because we can't monitor everyone all the time.
Maybe the Chinese Communist Party would be happy to give up freedom. Maybe not the Chinese people. It's a different thing, I think. Probably the Chinese people would want to have more freedom, but the Chinese Communist Party is not going to give them freedom.
Well, I don't know. I think I think they owe a lot to the Communist Party. Yeah.
Now, going back to the threats from super AI and this kind of weapons, what do you think about the concept of mutual assured destruction, the MAD concept, which we had during the Cold War? Is that effective? Is it more effective than regulations?
I think it's very dangerous because, going back to what we were saying earlier, there can be false alarms, misunderstandings, etc. And if you think back to the Cold War, I'm old enough to have been alive during much of the Cold War, and if we read what was said about the Cold War by people who were in power at that time, the memos of Kennedy and McNamara and people like that, it's fairly clear that they thought the risks were rather high. In fact, at the time of the Cuba crisis in 1962, Kennedy said the threat of a nuclear exchange was between 1 in 3 and evens. And McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense of America at that time, he said they were lucky rather than wise to survive the Cuba crisis. And of course, there's been documentation subsequently of various false alarms where this could be triggered. And so I think if we look back at the Cold War, we can say it worked. There was no exchange and mutually assured destruction. It did work because the game theory suggests that if people are rational and well informed, then they might avoid that. But I think, and I say in my book, that it was an unwise policy because if the chance was 1 in 3 or even 1 in 6, it's like playing a Russian roulette with 1 or 2 bullets in the cylinder, and you don't do that unless the stakes are very high or unless you value your life very low. And that's the situation we were placed under. And I myself, if I'd been asked, I would not have risked a 1 in 3 or even a 1 in 6 chance of the destruction of the fabric of European civilization, even if the alternative was a certain takeover by Russia of Western Europe.
Better red than dead, which is what Bertrand Russell said.
Indeed, yes, and he was quite right. And of course, we were lucky, but of course that's like the guy who plays Russian roulette. He may be lucky, but that doesn't mean it was a sensible gamble.
And then in the US, after a few years, someone said better dead than red.
That's right. Yes. Okay. And so I don't have much sympathy with them.
So we spoke about Cold War, and so when there was the Cold War, it was mainly the West against the East, or so say, sort of capitalist against the communists. But the good thing there was that we were sort of independent. We could make our goods in our countries, in the UK, Europe, US. But now the situation is different. Now, if we say there is a Cold War between, let's say, US and China, these two countries are strongly interdependent. So in case there is a war, then there will be a huge disruption in the supply chains, which is what happened with the pandemic. So what do you think would be the solution? Well, of course, the solution would be peace. But that's not always the thing that happens. But do you think we should reduce globalization and go more towards produce locally and where things are needed?
Well, I mean, I think globalization on the whole is probably good because it's an extra disincentive to having some sort of serious conflict. But on the other hand, I think what we've learnt is that there is another trade-off, which is the one between efficiency and resilience. And we've seen examples of that in that if you have a factory and you depend on parts coming from supply chains all over the world, and if there's a supply chain that leads to somewhere in the Far East, and if one link in that chain is broken, then that stops your production, then of course you're vulnerable. And I think people have learnt that it's probably worth the extra cost and, in a sense, the inefficiency of having multiple supply chains and keeping an inventory in stock rather than depending on just-in-time delivery in order to be more resilient if there is some unexpected crisis. So I think that's certainly a lesson that we're going to learn from this pandemic, that efficiency is not the only thing that matters. And to take a quite different example, Germany had a policy of keeping a larger fraction of its hospital intensive care beds empty all the time, except for a crisis, and 20%. So they could cope with the crisis better than we could, where we prided ourselves on 95% occupancy, which is, in a sense, more efficient, but it doesn't give you the headroom if there is a crisis. So that's another example where it's worth accepting inefficiency in order to be more resilient when there is a crisis.
Yeah, and then, of course, I mean, trying to reduce globalization will also help with other things like pollution, because, I mean, with these huge supply chains that go far, like to China and so on, I mean, they have a huge carbon footprint. Also, there is the issue of labor rights there and, plenty of issues there.
Yes, well, I'm not sure I agree with you in wanting to reduce globalization, but I think one thing which I do think very strongly is we need to do something to help Africa, because Africa is lagging behind in terms of its economic development, and it's also the area of the world where population is still growing fastest. Sub-Saharan Africa hasn't been through the demographic transition towards a lower birth rate, and so the population is growing fast. And there's a risk that Africa will be trapped in poverty, partly because they can't develop the way the East Asian countries did, which was by cheap manufacturing, undercutting the wage levels in Europe and North America, because robots are now doing that. We have what's called reshoring of manufacturing. in rich countries because it doesn't need so much labor. So that ladder's been kicked away from African countries. And so it's not so obvious how they are going to develop. The other point is that the one thing they do have is information and the ability to travel. They know via mobile phones what they're missing. They know the injustice of their fate. And if this huge inequality persists between the lifestyle of the average African and our lifestyles, then this is going to be a recipe for embitterment, mass migration, and conflict. And so I think there's a very strong motive for the northern countries, especially those in Europe, to have a sort of mega Marshall Plan in order to ensure that Africa doesn't fall further behind. And this is not just altruistic reasons, it's to make a safer and more stable world.
Yeah, I mean, but the problem is that I think colonialism never ended in Africa, right? I mean, we never stopped exploiting Africa in a way or another one. In the past, we used to send soldiers. Now maybe we pay some corrupt politician to get some resources from those places.
And I think there are positive as well as negative in the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative.
And also there are the wars that we started in North Africa, for example, that created all sorts of problems, for example, in Libya.
Indeed, yes. I mean, I think, the West, and especially the Americans, have a great deal to answer for.
Thank you for listening to this conversation with Professor Martin Rees. So if you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below, like, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and support this channel on Patreon. This podcast is also available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can find the links in the description below. Thanks for watching.